Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning for a presentation about our Integrated Early Care and Learning Plan. My name is Rita Chudnovsky, and I have the privilege of staffing the work on this plan and project on behalf of the two sponsoring organizations, the Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC and the Early Childhood Educators of BC. So just to begin, I want to draw a little bit of attention to this very first slide, which is the title of our plan, Community Plan for a Public System of Integrated Early Care and Learning. And I want to highlight two things from this slide. Those of you who are familiar with the child care field will know that a lot of the literature, the articles, the lingo talks about early learning and care, early learning and child care. And we have very explicitly made a decision to use the language early care and learning for two reasons. One is because it's been our experience in British Columbia that while things may start out being called early learning and care, what has happened way too often is that the first thing that gets dropped, the first thing that gets forgotten, the first thing that doesn't get funded is the care part. And so we wanted to put it up front in a way that we would hope would send a subtle message that it can't be forgotten. And the second reason is our much more philosophical, deeply held belief that without care there is no learning. The plan is a partnership, and the project to develop the plan is a partnership between two community organizations. In some other provinces, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, for example, the provincial governments commissioned people, gave them big budgets to develop plans for how it is that those provinces might bring together childcare and learning. That didn't happen in British Columbia. So this plan has not been mandated by government, it's not contracted by government, and it's not been funded by government. And it will only become provincial policy in British Columbia when we build enough support for it to impel the decision makers to implement it. Rather, it is a community initiative coming out of two organizations, the Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC, almost 30-year-old grassroots organization that has been fighting for quality, nonprofit, affordable childcare where early childhood educators are paid a decent wage for many, many years, and the Early Childhood Educators of British Columbia, the organization that promotes and supports early childhood educators and raises the profile about the importance of the work of early childhood educators in the community. The plan really came from both of our organizations recognizing that in British Columbia, change is here. Government is moving in a variety of ways and not moving in other ways that is leading to change for young children, their families, and childcare providers. And we face two choices. We could either wait for government to unroll whatever it is they're going to do and react, or we could use the evidence, our wisdom, and our experience to be proactive and put out our vision of how British Columbia could and should move forward. And clearly we chose the latter. It was a bit of a risk, but a risk that has been well worth taking. And we are pleased to say, and we say proudly, that the resulting plan that we're sharing with you today is concrete. It paints a concrete vision. It is innovative, and it is ambitious. The plan builds on well-established evidence, but it does not repeat that evidence. In fact, I want to encourage you to actually go home and read the plan. It's a pretty easy read. We've tried to make it as accessible as possible. But it builds on a number of pieces of evidence that we think are well-established and don't need to be reasserted. The first is that public spending in the early years is both a wise social and economic investment. The second is that quality childcare is early learning, that children learn through play-based programs in safe and nurturing relationships. And this divide that we seem to have in this province between what's viewed as learning and what's viewed as care is a false divide and a dangerous divide. It's also based on the evidence that says that high-quality programs for young children promote health and development and positive outcomes for children, but that poor quality can do harm. And so the plan really sets a very high standard for the quality of services. The plan is also based on the evidence that children and families in Canada and British Columbia have a right to quality early care and learning programs. Canada has signed international commitments, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, in which Canada actually committed to deliver on those rights, and they have yet to do so. And finally, the plan is based on the evidence that current approaches, both Canada-wide, with some exceptions, and for sure in British Columbia, are not working and are not meeting the needs of children, families, or communities. The plan you're looking at today has come out of quite an extensive and exciting process. In fact, a process that amazed and humbled us. We put out a draft plan with some of the key elements. We called it a briefing note in the fall, and we thought we would take it to a couple of audiences and see what people had to say. But the level of interest that it generated was phenomenal. So we did over 70 briefings in at least 25 communities around the province, mainly at the invitation of community groups. We hosted a webinar online. We had an online survey. We distributed over 5,000 copies of our draft plan, and in that process we reached thousands of British Columbians, and through a variety of methods received over 700 written responses to the emerging plan. And while for sure people had questions, and we think that in our final plan that you're looking at today, we have answered some of those questions and are clear around some of those things. And some people don't agree with the plan. You know, as my mom taught us, you're never going to have everybody liking you. Some people are not interested in building the kind of system that we are, and we acknowledge that. But the reality is that the response has been overwhelmingly positive. And we have been blown away by the nature of that positive response and the number of people in various communities that have been saying, this is what we've been waiting for, both in the childcare community and beyond. The plan responds to two conflicting realities in British Columbia. On the one hand, the BC government is moving to implement full school day kindergarten for 5-year-olds, and as of this coming September, that will be available as an option for any family in British Columbia who wants it. Just want to point out again that this is another place where we're using very explicit language, full school day kindergarten. Government will call it full day kindergarten or all day kindergarten, but as any working parent knows, 9 to 2:30, 9 to 3 is not a full day. So again, this is another bit of language we would encourage you to use. So they're moving forward to implement full school day kindergarten, and there is an outstanding promise that the previous Premier made a couple of years ago for some form of program for 3- and 4-year-olds, and we know that government is continuing to work on how they propose to deliver some program for 3- and 4-year-olds, and we can expect that they may announce something relatively soon. And this initiative is being delivered through the Ministry of Education and Boards of Education. So government itself is looking to the Ministry of Education and local boards of education to deliver on the commitment that they've made to younger children. So that's on the one hand. The extension of universal publicly funded services for younger children, democratically controlled and staffed by people who are respected and relatively well paid. On the other hand, we see a long-standing problem that is not being resolved, which is that there is absolutely no strategy to solve BC's childcare crisis. Childcare providers in BC interact on a daily basis with the families of over 65,000 children. That makes childcare the largest family support program in the province, and yet families and children, early childhood educators, employers continue to experience a crisis on a daily basis. And for us, the crisis is marked by 4 pretty simple straight-ahead indicators. Fees are too high, the second highest expense for young families after housing. Quality childcare costs more than post-secondary education today. Wages are too low, as many in this room will know. So early childhood educators with college training continue to work for wages that leave them and their families below the poverty line, forces many early childhood educators to leave the sector to be able to support their families, which affects quality. Too few spaces. We still only have a licensed or regulated space for about 20% of BC's children from birth to 12, even though the vast majority of mothers are in the labor force. And the fourth indicator, which is of increasing concern to us, is that we are seeing the growth of big box commercial childcare in British Columbia. All of the international evidence tells us that this is not the way to meet the needs of children and families and communities. It's not only us that's saying there's a crisis. The international evidence shows why there is a crisis. Much to the shock of many Canadians, Canada ranks last on a number of important measures for how it is we invest in our young children. Canada ranks last out of 20 developed countries in terms of levels of access to programs for young children. Canada ranks last out of 14 developed countries in terms of the percentage of our gross domestic product that we spend on young children. This really does cause people to take a breath because it is not Canadians' self-image of ourselves. So we encourage you to make sure your communities know about this. Just to look at the question of funding in a slightly different way. This is a different way of graphing the percentage of gross domestic product that the various countries spend on early care and learning. Canada, again, is at the bottom. And Canada spends 0.25%, that's 1/4% on programs for young children of GDP. And that includes what is being spent in Quebec, which actually has a system. Outside of Quebec, what we see is too few spaces, not great quality, high cost, and inadequate inclusion of children with extra support needs. British Columbia currently spends even less than that as a percentage of our gross domestic product, 0.22%. And even with the funding of full school day kindergarten, we'll only be spending 0.28, so just over 1/4% of gross domestic product on young children, even with the funding of full school day kindergarten. This is well below the average of the OECD, and even further below the benchmark set by UNICEF that countries should be spending at least 1% of gross domestic product on young children. The plan is, we're proud to say, a Made in BC plan. It draws on national and international models and examples and is informed by it, but it is not exactly the same as anybody else's plan. We've had the advantage of watching how things have played out elsewhere and tried to pick the things that we think are a best fit for BC and develop some innovative ideas that we hope others will look to. The first is that it leads us to reject corporate and commercial childcare as the solution, but also that it leads us to pay more attention to a national and international trend that sees a growing role for the Ministry of Education or Ministries of Education in the lives of young children. So just for you to know, 4 provinces and 2 territories in Canada have already moved childcare into the Ministries of Education. So this is a trend, and for those interested, we have on our website an environmental scan that looks at what's going on in every province and territory about the involvement of education in the early years. I want to focus just on 3 other things that we learn from elsewhere, because we really hope you'll see them reflected in the plan, and they really kind of stuck with us. The first is that where systems are working well for children, for families, for communities, and for the economy, it is where governments have moved to integrate care and learning under one ministry. That has not been the case in BC, but where it's working well, they have recognized a need to do that. The second thing we learn from the international evidence is that where that integration is being pursued, homes in a Department of Education or a Ministry of Education have been the most effective. We know there's some concerns about that in BC, and we'll return to those, but that is a pretty important and consistent message. But, and this is really critical for us, we also learned that in order for that integration to be successful, childcare and education or early learning need to come to the table as strong and equal partners. And we are well aware that today in British Columbia, childcare cannot come to the table with education as an equal partner. And so there are a number of elements in our plan that are designed to strengthen the capacity of childcare to come to the table as a strong and equal partner. Just again to show you why it is that childcare doesn't come to the table as a strong and equal partner, amongst other things, we just want to show you a way of comparing the amount of money that's invested by the province in the kindergarten to grade 12 system compared to childcare. So this is what the province of BC invests on average in every child currently in our K-12 system, okay? About $8,400. If we take all of the children from birth to 12 in British Columbia, and we look at how much the government of British Columbia invests in childcare services, that averages $382 per child. If we do it by number of licensed spaces, the total childcare budget divided by the number of licensed spaces, it still only takes us to around $2,500. And if we look just at the operating fund that government gives to childcare, because the subsidy, the other main form of childcare spending, is really to parents. So we look at operating funding going to every licensed space for a 3 to 5-year-old, we see that we're not even at $1,400. So no matter how we cut it, and while we recognize that there still are lots of needs in the education system, it should be no surprise and should not be seen as our problem or our fault, it's our problem maybe, that childcare doesn't come to the table as a strong and equal partner. Our plan tries to integrate the best then of both the public education system and the best of quality childcare. Emily's going to speak a little later to the strengths that we are drawing on from the public education system, but I do want right now to highlight the strengths of quality community-based childcare that deeply matter to us and that we have really worked hard to not only protect, but to grow within the plan so that they can be a positive influence up the education system. First of all, we are really focused on holding on to programs for young children that keep care at the core and that don't become a downward extension of an academic focus, academic testing model, but remain true to the values of early childhood education, which is that children thrive in caring relationships. Also, we draw on from quality childcare programs and a philosophy and values that respect children's rights. And for us, that means their right to be who they are now and to quality of life for who they are today, not just about who they will become. Do we say that the purpose of grade 3 is for kids to be ready for grade 4, right? So this is about respecting children for the right to be who they are today. Programs that are play-based, that are holistic, and programs that are at a scope and a scale where that intimate relationship between family and caregiver can be maintained, where that relationship remains face-to-face and a really important one. We really look for a plan that would build on those things. Finally, for my part today, just as we know that children thrive in environments at home, in the community, and in the world, right, that support their development, so too this plan will thrive in a bigger environment with some key supportive elements in place. And so the plan calls for 4 important elements in the bigger world beyond the plan that will make this doable. The first is that we need at the provincial and federal level strong family policy that provides for families, young families who really are feeling the crunch these days, both time to parent, resources to do that, and services. So the plan calls for extended parental leave of up to 18 months. It calls for poverty reduction and income support programs, and it addresses the key missing service that has been identified in supporting young families, which is early care and learning. Secondly, the plan says that there is a role for both the provincial and federal governments The province has a responsibility to commit to the plan and implement it, and the federal government has a responsibility to develop a good, strong, extended parental leave program and to transfer dedicated money to the provinces and territories that will be used to build this kind of a system. The third is the importance of recognizing and respecting First Nation and Aboriginal control, ensuring they have the funds that they need to develop and deliver their own programs, while recognizing that all community programs need to be culturally welcoming and celebratory for all children. And finally, the plan requires a new investment of stable and significant funds. We are not talking about taking money from any other program in order to fund this. We think this is well worth and deserves a significant investment, and that the community needs government to commit to that investment being stable over 5 to 10 years so that we can get on with the job of delivering the services.